now 7 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So, my name is Marissa Purcell. I'm the head curator here at the James Whitcomb Riley Boyhood Home and Museum. Those of you who are familiar with me know me very well. For those of you who don't, welcome. Today's lecture is going to be about James Whitcomb Riley, the teenage years, or as Mr. Riley himself put it, his salad days. Now, some of you may be wondering why James Whitcomb Riley would choose to describe his teenage years as his salad days. Do I have any guesses why he may have decided to call those years that? Anybody wondering why?
It was the beginning before he was on track.
That's what you have.
It is a very nice looking salad. I may have been hungry when I was picking that out. I may have not had my lunch yet. James Whitcomb Riley, when he was interviewed by Marcus Dickey for the youth of James Whitcomb Riley, described it as his salad days because, as he quoted, "My salad days," he said, "is when I was green in judgment." So the reason he called his teenage years is because he may have made some poor choices when he was a teenager, and we're going to talk about why. That handsome young man you see standing right there by the salad is James Whitcomb Riley as a teenager. It is part of the Indiana Historical Society collection, and they estimate that he is about 16, 17 years old when that picture is taken. By the time that picture is taken, a lot has changed for the Rileys, and you can see it in his face. His child world that he wrote about in one of his poems is gone. It's gone forever. When James Whitcomb Riley was born, October 7th, 1849, he was born somewhere here on this property. We believe that the original log cabin that the Rileys had would have been located on this side of the property where the museum stands. So, based on the research that I and my hostesses have been doing, we think that it was actually on the right corner of the lot, or left corner of the lot. Riley grew up in a very sheltered household. Reuben Riley, his father, was a well-respected lawyer and politician. His mother, Elizabeth Riley, was a very well-respected member of the community. Riley and his siblings grew up playing in the apple orchards, going to the old swimming pool, playing hooky. Riley was not the best student in the world. He was a little bit wild and free sometimes, and Elizabeth often inspired stories of fairies and goblins, and when little orphan Annie came to live with them, Mary Alice Smith, she also encouraged that imagination that Riley had. James Whitcomb Riley grew up seeing all of the wagons go across US 40. He got to see interesting characters as they came and worked, and it was a magical, wonderful world. Until an event called the Civil War happened. When James Whitcomb Riley was 11 years old, about to turn 12, the Civil War broke out. Fort Sumter was fired upon April of 1861. And this is really the beginning of a change, not only for Riley as he's entering his preteens, but for the Riley family as a whole, in addition to the community of Greenfield and the nation. It's really important because Captain Reuben Riley, as pictured right up there, his father, enlists and goes to fight in the Civil War. When Reuben enlisted at that time, it was thought that the Civil War would not last very long. A lot of people from the North thought that it would be over in a few months. Well, they were mistaken, and the South put up a fight. But Reuben, being a leading politician and upstanding citizen at the time, went to go fight. Before the Civil War, the Rileys were very well-to-do. They were what we would consider upper middle class. If you step into the house next door, you will see evidence that they were upper middle class before the war. I have never seen 2 presses in a sitting room very much before I started working at the Riley home. And I often get asked why there are 2 presses. Well, I don't know the official answer. But it is unusual, and it may have been Reuben's way of saying that his family needed 2 presses. My family has enough things to put in 2 presses. So when he goes off, he is a man full of prospects. His family is full of prospects, and he has very high expectations for what his sons will do. In A Hoosier Boy, written by Minnie Bell Mitchell, it talks about the Civil War years for Riley as he's becoming a teenager. Riley turns 13 in 1862. While the Civil War is happening, he's transitioning into that young man he will become. But guess who's not there for it? The stories in Minnie Bell Mitchell's book, they don't talk about Reuben very much because Reuben's gone. And young men, especially when they're becoming teenagers, need a certain role model, and Reuben was gone.
Who is Minnie Bell?
Minnie Bell Mitchell was the founder of the Riley Old Home Society. She was married to John Mitchell Jr., and they are actually the people who helped build this house here. That is now serving as the museum. But the family, the Mitchell family, owned the first daily newspaper here in Greenfield.
And they also had a printing company.
And they had a printing company, yes. So, Minnie Bell ended up writing a book of stories that she had collected from the time that James Whitcomb Riley was a boy. And she ended up writing this book. And she tells stories about Bud, that was James Whitcomb Riley's nickname when he was a child, and what he and Jonty, his older brother John, were up to. One of the stories in that book talks about James Whitcomb Riley's first real experience with the outside world and why it could affect somebody negatively. One of those stories talks about going to see his grandmother. And he's going to go talk to her, like he always does, because guess who's come home on furlough? His father, and that was very rare. He went as excited, and he wanted to tell his grandmother, who was Reuben's mother, that her son was back. But when he got there, his grandmother was nervous. She didn't want to answer the door. And Riley didn't understand why. He's like, well, grandmother, don't you want me to come into the house and visit? She's like, no, I really don't. Go away. She didn't say it like that, but that's kind of the tone she implied. Well, Riley, I don't think he was one to take no for an answer very often. Got his way and slid past her, and when he went into the kitchen, there was this thin, gaunt man sitting at her kitchen table. And this man resembled his father. It was his uncle who had escaped from a prisoner of war camp and had come to Margaret Riley's house for refuge because Reuben's older brother was a Confederate soldier. And his grandmother looked at him and said, Bud, do not tell anybody what you've seen here today, because if you do, we're all in trouble. And I think that was Riley's first real understanding. Yes, father's away, it's hard on us, but it's the first understanding of, oh, it's different, because when father comes home, we're waving goodbye to him as a hero. But there's the other side of the story, and it's really tearing families apart. I think that was Riley's first eye-opener that was happening. Another eye-opener that was happening was what was happening to his own father, Reuben, and other men that went to go fight in the Civil War. Reuben would come home a changed man. Reuben, when he went off to fight, fought in a battle called the Battle of Rich Mountain early on in 1861. When he went to fight and involved in that battle, he was on the front lines and a shell exploded over his head. He had bullets whizzing past him, and the carnage he saw, nobody should see in their lifetime. There is a letter that he sent to William Mitchell of the Mitchell Printing Company and newspaper owner, where he described the troops, the regiment's experiences with that battle. Before they even got to battle, they suffered from dysentery, Reuben included. In fact, Reuben still had dysentery when he was writing that letter. And he talked about how they were marching for hours on end, and how when they got to the battle, they were almost ambushed. And they were fighting, but they were fighting valiantly, and Reuben believed that they would win. But the shells are exploding, the bullets are going past, and after it's all over, there are bodies everywhere. And Reuben writes that the carnage is so bad, I really hope that I never see anything like it again. And that was only 4 months into the Civil War. And Reuben serves until 1864. It greatly affected Reuben at that time. He still had hope in that letter that that war would easily be won and that they would be coming back home in a few weeks. Reuben never recovers completely from that moment on. He is a changed man from that moment on. He came back, the shell exploded over him, paralyzed one of his sides, and he could never hear properly out of one of his ears again. When the enlistment with that volunteer regiment ends, he ends up enlisting in the cavalry. I'm actually going to go back to this slide. He enlists in the cavalry as a captain and serves with that regiment until he is honorably discharged in 1864. Reuben's honorably discharged in 1864 before the end of the war because it's quite clear by that point he's never going to recover from the being paralyzed. And he's more of a liability at that point to them. In this picture here, which you can see, courtesy of the Riley Old Home Society, I think this picture must have been taken after, because that one that's on his knee, the fingers are kind of like that. So I think this is after he's already had that injury. When he comes home from war, he had what they called severe melancholia. By the time Edmund Idle is writing about his grandfather, Edmund says Grandpa had shell shock. In today's day and age, PTSD. And he had moments where he would slip back into it. And it wasn't just Reuben who was changed. It was other people that Riley had known throughout his childhood that were changing. You have young men going off to serve in the Civil War. You have boys going and serving in the Civil War. James Whitcomb Riley talks about how by the time he got to his teenage years, especially his mid-teens, a lot of those friends that he used to play with at the old swimming hole were gone. They were either serving in the Civil War, had died in the Civil War, or were filling other roles because their brothers or their fathers were fighting in the Civil War. They had all been forced to grow up, and Riley was trying to hold on to the past. He was not ready to give that up. These examples that you see up here are 3 young men from the Indiana Historical Society, and they are an example of them going off to fight, And then you have Johnny Clem, who was only age 12 when he went off to fight. James Whitcomb Riley was very blessed and very lucky that he did not go off to fight. One of the consequences of the Civil War was not only had Reuben Riley been changed, but the Riley's finances had changed. James Whitcomb Riley, at age 15, was uprooted from the only home he had ever known. When Reuben came back because of his war injuries, because of what had happened, he came back to his law practice that had been suffering while he was gone, and he could never get it back and going the way it had before the Civil War. He didn't have the drive that he had before the Civil War, and he never was the same person. So the finances for the Rileys started to deteriorate. The other thing that happened is Reuben acquired land in Kansas. And Reuben decided that he wanted the whole family to move to Kansas to get a fresh start. For a historian, knowing that information, it probably was how Reuben was wanting to deal with all the trauma he had seen. If I leave, I don't have to think about it. I won't be seeing faces that I served with. I'm going to be removed. But he didn't talk to his family. But in Victorian times, the man didn't have to. The man, when he made a decision, it was expected that the family were to follow him. So he purchased the land in Kansas, sold the family homestead, and told the family they were leaving. And then, we don't know 100% for sure. It's still a little bit of a mystery on why it didn't happen. But what I've been researching and what I have seen from the different articles I've read is I believe Elizabeth put her foot down, which is also rare for the Victorian period for that to happen. So not only has Reuben done those things, he's come home and his 2 teenage sons are a bit wild because Elizabeth often indulged what they wanted to do. She was a good mother, but she perhaps babied them a little bit too much, according to Reuben. And now he has a wife that's putting her foot down. Well, Reuben's pretty stubborn too, and he's not going to give up. What I had been told when I first started was they lost everything. They lost the house, they lost the farm that they had on the west side of Greenfield, and they lost the land they had in Kansas because Reuben couldn't keep it all. Well, I found a record that said that Reuben kept the land in Kansas until after Elizabeth died. He was stubborn until the end of Elizabeth's life. He had always intended to, I think, outwait her until she would say, fine, let's go to Kansas. But that still meant that there was great change for the Rileys because all of a sudden, that's not James Whitcomb Riley's house. That's not his child role anymore. He is becoming a young man already, and now he's completely had his boyhood ripped out from underneath him. And James Whitcomb Riley was somebody who did not like change. How do you think he handled that? Not well. He was mad, and that was the beginning of what would become a contentious relationship between him and Reuben for the rest of Reuben's life. James Whitcomb Riley blamed Reuben for losing this house and for making them then live in what he described as poverty. From the records I found, the Rileys certainly were not as well-to-do as they had been. And I do not think that Reuben was providing what he had provided before. They did go days where there was no food in the house. They were just eating crackers and water. But I also don't think that they were living in as much squalor as maybe he exaggerated when he was in his 60s and he was trying to paint a myth about his childhood. But those years are tricky because we don't actually know where they ended up. There is a gap where we don't know where they were living. So he said that during his teenage years, they would travel from house to house. They'd stay in one house for a while, and then they'd have to leave. Then they'd go to another house, and at one point, they ended up having to stay with his grandmother, Margaret, who was not happy that all these people had just descended on her tiny home. And that caused tension between his grandmother, Margaret, and his mother, Elizabeth. So Riley was watching all this, and he's also watching Elizabeth start to become in poor health. And he's building resentment as a young teenager towards his father. We don't know when Reuben and the Rileys ended up in the old seminary. At least I haven't found the information yet. But during those years, he said that they were moving until they finally ended up somewhere that was closer to the edge of town, according to the youth of James Whitcomb Riley. And it was then that he decided that he wanted to try to explore what one of his loves had been, was making rhymes. Reuben, on the other hand, did not approve. America at that point was entering into what we now call the Reconstruction period, the Reconstruction era. And things were changing. So when James Whitcomb Riley was a boy, it is more farm-oriented. It is frontier-oriented. After the Civil War, you're starting to see a rise in industrialization in Indiana. As one of my hostesses says, he likes to say, things were a-changin'. But as I said, the Rileys were often without food or money. Friends who came home were changed. Things in Greenfield were changing. Indiana was rapidly transitioning from that frontier. You're starting to see locomotives, more locomotives come through. You're starting to see factories spring up. And it's very important in the eyes of a lot of men for their boys to know mathematics. Because if you're going to get a job in the factory, or if you're going to get a job with engineering anything, you need to know math. And James Whitcomb Riley failed at it miserably. And Reuben was not happy. So remember how I briefly mentioned that Riley was not the best student when he was a boy? That continued. James Whitcomb Riley would end up going to school until 1870, and Reuben was dismayed because he would continue to play hooky. There's one story from the youth of James Whitcomb Riley that talks about how James decided he was going to play hooky because the passage he was going to read in front of school that day would make him cry. And so he skipped school. And because of his history of skipping school, nobody believed him that it would make him cry. So when Reuben heard it, he was incensed. And he called Riley into his office and said, "Why did you skip school?" And Riley told him what I just told you. And Reuben said, "That is the worst thing that worst excuse I have ever heard in my life." Because at that point, especially when you have become a teenager and you're about to be a man, you need to be able to control those emotions and not be sensitive. And Reuben was dismayed. Now his son, who has already shown that he's terrible at mathematics, is now showing that he's too sensitive. So Reuben decided that he was going to correct that. And according to Riley, gave him the worst whipping of his life. When he would go to the old swimming pool at that point, and he would come home. Reuben would say, "What did you do today?" He would say it, and Reuben would say, "When are you going to get a job?" Because by 15, middle of teenage years, a lot of boys were starting to get jobs in either the grocery store or apprenticeships, and it would cause friction between them because Riley would drag his heels. Reuben wanted Riley to be a lawyer and follow in his footsteps. His older brother, John, was very sickly. He had always been weaker, and he had always shown an aptitude to be a businessman. And that was fine with Reuben. So he wanted his second son to follow in the lawyer footsteps. Guess what you also need to know if you're going to be a lawyer? Math. Riley said that when he studied law, it was the most boring thing he ever saw in his life. So if Reuben had a checklist for all the things he wanted his teenage son to do, there's an X forming in all of those check boxes. And Reuben is getting very frustrated. "I'll make a man out of you," is what Reuben wanted to do with Riley. As I said, he wanted him to be a lawyer. He thought he was too immature, and he would tell Riley that he would never amount to much. In fact, at one point, Reuben, when Riley's, again, remember this is all happening when Riley's a teenager, Reuben is telling him that the family will probably have to support him the rest of his life because he's never going to do anything. Can you imagine being told that as a young teenage boy who's still thinking of what his aspirations are going to be? That he will never amount to anything, and that they're going to have to support him for the rest of his life. Again, he was told he was too sensitive, but it wasn't just that. The whole town was also telling him that. By the time he gets to his late teens, the whole town's telling him, "You're never going to amount to much if you don't do this, this, and this." Reuben, when he decided that James Whitcomb Riley was clearly not going to be a lawyer, decided that, well, maybe he needs to learn how to be a farmer. Yeah, that didn't happen either. Even though Riley loved to write about farm life and what happened on the farm, he did not like the work that went along with being a farmer. One day, he was gardening in the garden with Reuben after having told Reuben that he was going out on the town. And Reuben said, "No, you're not. You're in the garden with me." And James Whitcomb Riley went to the garden and started hoeing vegetables with Reuben. And Reuben starts giving him the same lecture of, if you don't start doing things, you're never going to go anywhere in life. And that's when James Whitcomb Riley reached a breaking point, threw down his hoe, and showed everybody that he, too, like his brother Reuben Alexander Humboldt, and Reuben also had quite the temper.
Also what?
Had quite the temper. He threw it to the ground, jumped the fence, and stormed off into downtown Greenfield. Half an hour later, he came to the garden patch, stood in front of Reuben and said, "I came here not to agree to what you're telling me, but to apologize to you for shouting at you in my temper. But I'm telling you, what you're telling me to do will not happen." And from then on, Reuben almost washed his hands of the boy and would go around and tell people, "I don't know what's going to become of him." Reuben would often say that, and Elizabeth Riley would often tell people, "Don't worry, Jimmy's going to turn out right. Trust me, Jimmy will turn out all right." He had an aptitude for the art. He was very good at drawing. He was also very good at painting. So it was around that time that he started to take lessons as an older teenager. How to paint signs, And he would go around Greenfield doing contracts to paint different buildings, fences, schoolhouses, and that was how he earned some extra money. One of the places where he earned extra money as a teenager was a place called the George Knox's Barber Shop. How many of you have heard of George Knox before? For those of you who have not, George Knox was a barber in Greenfield in the 1870s. He owned a barber shop on the corner of State Road 9 and US 40, where City Hall is today. It was located in Gooding Tavern. And he operated a barber shop and George Knox was African American, and he operated a shop that served the white population, where they would come in and get their hair cut, and also spill their information about local politics. And because of that, he became quite a powerful man in the community. Well, he had boys come into his shop to get their hair cut, and James Whitcomb Riley was one of them. And while the other boys would often annoy him after a while, James Whitcomb Riley never did. George Knox talks about how Riley was different. He was quiet. He would study you. And then after a while, he would create a character, and he would start acting it out. And George Knox liked that because not only was it entertaining, but it was entertaining to his customers. So George Knox's barber shop was one of the first places that Riley got to express his imagination and got to invent those characters that later he would put into his poetry. He painted shaving mugs for George Knox, earned money that way. And finally, when Reuben was like, you either get a job or you get out of my house, he ended up going and working for a shoemaker named Thomas Snow. And then Thomas Snow died 2 weeks after Riley started from tetanus. And so any dreams of being a cobbler died with Thomas Snow for James Whitcomb Riley. So James Whitcomb Riley really did try his hand at different occupations. None of them were for him except for the painting. And what he would do, especially when he became a young adult, is he would travel around and paint marketing signs, and eventually tried the moniker labeled as the painter poet. His teenage years were marked with a lot of tension, a lot of different realities than what his childhood had been, but the final end to his teenage years was his mother Elizabeth passing away at the age of 47. She had been the children's compass, morally. She was the one that they were the closest to, and when she passed away, the world was ripped out from all of the children. Elva May, his sister, he said would just stare at the wall for hours while she was doing the chores. That was her way of handling it. Riley went crazy. He did not know what he was going to do without her because she had been his supporter. She had always supported his imagination where Reuben had not, and now she's gone. Her death was unexpected to them. She just died suddenly one morning of what we would now call congestive heart failure. So she died of congestive heart failure. Because she died probably at one of the most turning points of his life, where he's coming out of those wild teenage years. He's an adult now. He needs guidance on what he's supposed to do, and Reuben's certainly not giving it anymore. He ends up struggling for the next 10 years of his life to figure out what he's doing with himself. His teenage years set him up for struggling. And it also set him up for his problem with alcohol. Because Elizabeth passed away, and he's already been seen as a failure, he ends up drowning some of those sorrows with alcohol. And it becomes an issue that he then battles for the rest of his life. His teenage years had lasting consequences and effects, as I just mentioned. One of them was also his relationship with his father, Reuben. Reuben and he, I will give them credit, really tried hard to maintain a relationship. They would write letters back and forth with each other, but it was never the warm feelings that you get from a parent. Reuben would often write him of, they're making a big deal about your poetry, but I don't understand it. And so the rest of James Whitcomb Riley's life, he's trying to prove to Reuben what he couldn't prove in those teenage years and early adulthood. He's always trying to strive to do better, to prove himself to Reuben that I have made it, that I have made something out of myself. Because Reuben's still saying, I don't understand why you're famous. I don't understand why everybody loves you so much. And that is one of the lasting consequences for Riley, is the one person in his life who he probably was looking for approval never ends up giving him approval. Completely. So James Whitcomb Riley would often say, as I said in the beginning, that his teenage years were his salad years. We all have our salad years. Some are different salads than others. James Whitcomb Riley had what he called the Caesar salad. His salad years were so great that they are best not remembered. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end my part of the speech on James Whitcomb Riley in his teenage years, but I'm opening the floor for some questions. Do any of you have any questions about James Whitcomb Riley's teenage years?
How many children were there? There was he and his brother and his sister, just the three?
There were 6 siblings total. 5 of them ended up living into adulthood, though his brother Humboldt dies in his early 20s. So there was John Andrew, there was Martha Celeste, she died as a toddler. There's James Whitcomb Riley, his sister Elva May, his brother Humboldt, and then his sister Mary Elizabeth. So there were 6 children. Yes?
I read that years later, when Reuben was in his later years, that James took him to Indianapolis and took him to a tailor and had a fine suit made for him.
That's the thing with Reuben, is he would do things for Riley like that, but never quite understood what was happening with James.
It would seem like that time, as he said, "You were able to afford this?" And James said, "Yes."
Yeah. Yes.
Well, my comment is with Reuben, if for people that like to travel, down at Chattanooga, Tennessee, is the battlefield of Chickamauga. And they have a section for each of the states that fought there. And in the Indiana section, Reuben Riley's name is mentioned.
Oh, is it? Yeah. Oh, interesting.
And
It's on the monument.
it's on.
Okay. Very interesting. That would be another example of a bigger battle he would have been involved in. And do no, you're fine.
Do we know where Riley's mother was buried?
She's buried in Park Cemetery. So Reuben, Elizabeth, John Andrew, and his wife Julia, Martha Celeste, Alexander Humboldt are all buried in Park Cemetery. Elva May, Mary Elizabeth, Leslie Payne, and Riley are all buried in Crown Hill Cemetery. Elva May is buried there because her husband Henry Idle had plots in Crown Hill Cemetery. So his sisters and he are in Crown Hill, and well, except for one sister, and the rest of them are here in Greenfield. And that's maybe a lecture for a different day on the battle between Indianapolis and Greenfield over Mr. Riley. Any other questions?
In Maybelle Mitchell's book, she talks a lot about Riley sneaking off to Old Urban, I think was the man's name, out at, what's the well house now at Riley Park. I don't know how much of that story is true, or how much Minnie Bell just sort of added some extra interesting things
I will say that it's probably true he visited Irvin Hunt.
Okay.
That particular story that she has, I did find in a newspaper article from an interview Riley gave himself, so that story probably is
Okay,
true.
so, okay.
There are a couple other stories from Minnie Bell Mitchell that I haven't, like I don't have any second confirmation.
Well, would she have been, what would be the timeline for her compared to Riley? Because wasn't she much younger than Riley?
I believe she was younger than Riley by at least 15-ish years, maybe, like 15, 20 years. So she's getting this knowledge from stories she's hearing from the community. She is friends with Riley, so he's probably telling her stories too. James Whitcomb Riley's an interesting person because he very much was straightforward and told the truth about his boyhood until you get to about 1910. And then in 1911, James Whitcomb Riley has his first stroke. And it's after his first stroke that I tend to see his stories about his childhood get a little bit more exaggerated and get a little bit more mystical. And so most of what Minnie Bell Mitchell has in there is probably true.
Okay.
Urban talking about as well, I think.
I believe so, yeah. Any other questions?
A comment,
Yes.
the view from Riley's tomb up on the very top of that cemetery, you can look out over all of Indianapolis. It's an amazing view.
I've only been up there once, but I was amazed with the view I saw when I was up there. And I just kept thinking, I'm at the tallest spot in Indianapolis, naturally. This is really cool, and it's very awe-inspiring that that's where they chose to bury him. That's how loved he was, is that's where they chose to bury him. Yes.
Of course, quite famous with Riley is the old swimming hole. Now, there's a tourist location in the park, and that's not where they swam. It's 1 mile to the south, the railroad bridge is where the actual swimming hole was.
Yep. This would be correct, because there's often descriptions of him that they would see the train from where they were swimming.
But it's a great location in the park.
It is a great location in the park. Because I work for the Parks Department, I agree, it's a great location in the park.
Wouldn't want it anyplace else.
Well, that explains why Edmund Idle took over all his financial affairs, because he wasn't capable of it.
He wasn't capable of it. He often said that the letters swam on the page. He would say that one looked like it was going for a swim in the old swimming hole. You can't diagnose somebody in the past, but you can have a theory. My sister has a mild case of dyslexia, and it sounds an awful lot like dyscalculia to me. Where I think Riley actually did have a learning disability. And back then, they don't even, what is that? We don't even know what that is. So for him, I think he was struggling because he was like, he really had trouble. And nobody understood that quite the same way. So it makes me wonder if he had some version of dyscalculia going on. Probably a severe case of it too, if one of them swimming up to one corner and swimming back down as he described doing. Either that or he got so cross-eyed staring at it that it seemed like they were doing that. He wasn't quite as bad completely as he let on though. Because a report card from 1870 shows that he is getting very good grades in reading and rhetoric and excellent in deportment. He's a gentleman. But he is getting passable grade in math. So he's not doing great, but he's also not completely failing either. So I think that he could probably do very little, like he could probably do adding and subtracting, but anything beyond that was probably getting hard.
But he couldn't keep like a ledger of what his expenses and what he was taking in.
He could not. There's a story that talks about how he would have a bunch of pennies in his pocket, and he would get questioned, how many pennies you have in his pocket, and he would go, this many. How many he had in his hand? This many. So he had trouble. He had real trouble. It was not because he wasn't smart, it was because he was having trouble with it. There's a lot from his teenage years that, to me, explains why some of his life went certain ways that it did, and one of them was his trouble with math.
What about Leo Harris? Because he recognized his ability with words.
Yes. Leo Harris, the namesake of Harris Elementary, was one of his supporters during his late teens into his early 20s of helping to inspire Riley for his education. Leo Harris saw the intelligence that Riley had, and he saw the inspiration Riley had, and encouraged Riley to continue with his education. And he really encouraged Riley to stop reading those dime novels he's picking up from the store and to read classic literature. So Leo Harris was a great influence in Riley. Riley would often say that his mother was his biggest influence, but Leo Harris was in the top 3. Anybody else? Well, I would like to thank everybody for coming out tonight. If for any reason you do have more questions, I'm usually here at the Boys at Home, and I'm happy to answer any